On March 5, 1958, Marvin Lawrence Winans was born in Detroit, Michigan. His family was already well known for their unique brand of gospel music. There was more to the Winans family than music. They had a strong religion and were spiritual leaders. In a home full of prayer, church, and music, Marvin's parents, David Pop Winnie and Dolores Mom Winans, reared 10 children. Marvin appeared to have been destined to sing and preach from the beginning. He was a member of a group known as the Testimony Singers when he was younger, along with his siblings. That group later evolved into the Winans, one of the most well-known and influential gospel groups in history. You won't believe how quickly their music became a global sensation. They didn't only sing praise in their songs, they were unique, passionate, and full of soul. Let me tell you, people's bones tingled when the Winans sang. Marvin's voice was distinctive, smooth, powerful, and emotional. It was more than simply music, though. It had to do with purpose. He wasn't just acting, he was serving as a minister. The trio received appreciation from both mainstream audiences and gospel fans, and they earned Grammy Awards as their popularity increased. Marvin possessed a unique talent. He was able to spread the gospel outside of the church. He began to develop into more than just a singer in this way. People followed him, paid attention to him, and admired him. This is the startling part, though. Despite all of the success, Marvin's personal life was gradually getting out of hand. In 1978, he wed Vicki Winans. They appeared to be an ideal duo, strong in both ministry and music. Their love and faith inspired others, making them the perfect gospel couple in the eyes of their fans. They encouraged one another's professions, sung together, and preached together. Marvin Jr., their son, also followed in their footsteps. However, not everything that appears flawless on stage remains flawless offstage. It becomes intriguing at this point. Whispers started to circulate. Church circles began to converse. When rumors of infidelity started to circulate, many people thought Marvin was the one who was cheating. Nobody wanted to believe it at first. How could a preacher who focused on family and faith be involved in such an activity? However, the indications were present. Public appearances by the pair began to decline. On stage, they had a different vibe. Fans saw the tension, the distance, and the breaking of something. The most bizarre aspect was that Vicki made subliminal clues in interviews, despite the fact that neither of them spoke candidly at the time. She discussed being tested, treachery, and emotional suffering. People could infer Marvin's name even though she never mentioned it out loud. Then it took place. Vicki Winans and Marvin were divorced in 1995. It was devastating for their admirers. It was startling for the gospel community, a devastated couple who had led countless people in worship. The divorce marked more than just the dissolution of a marriage. It was the breakdown of a public persona based on love, togetherness, and religion. Nevertheless, the controversy's shadow persisted. Despite Marvin and Vicki's efforts to move on with their lives and careers, people asked queries. People were unsure. And Marvin carried the burden of that story with him everywhere he went, even though he seldom ever spoke about it explicitly. What distinguishes the story? Marvin didn't vanish, but most individuals in scandals do. Even as people muttered behind his back, he continued to sing and teach. Marvin Winans maintained a solid public front during the divorce, but his inner life wasn't quite stable. He was more shaken by the breakup than most people realized. Awards continued to come in, churchgoers continued to refer to him as pastor, and fans continued to applaud him at concerts. But there was a tempest brewing for the man behind the microphone. Living in the spotlight while attempting to move past a failed marriage was not easy, let me tell you. And fate took a surprising turn just when most believed the dispute was finished. Marvin was stopped during a routine traffic stop in Detroit in 2012. What ought to have been a straightforward incident swiftly became newsworthy. He was found to be driving with a suspended license by the police. This might not have been significant to the typical individual, but Marvin was no ordinary person. He was a public figure, a clergyman, and a gospel celebrity. The word quickly got around. Social media began to buzz. He was defended by some. He was criticized by others. This is how, when you're in the spotlight, even the smallest error can make the main page. Here's the startling bit, though. Further investigation was made possible by that arrest. People began to inquire further about his church, personal life, and even his financial situation. Older rumors started to reappear as journalists looked for anything controversial. Once dormant stories came back to life, the media seemed to be preventing him from moving on. What is unique about this story? The majority of celebrities deal with scandals, resolve them, and move on. Marvin, however, was unique. He was held to more than merely celebrity standards. Because of his position as a preacher, he was subjected to religious ones. It becomes intriguing at this point. Another controversy simmered in the background while Marvin dealt with legal issues from within his own family this time. Known for their musical harmony, the Wyan family began to exhibit signs of discord. The public began to hear little quarrels amongst family members. There were disputes about personal preferences, business, and music rights. Not all of it took place in public, but the majority did. Tension was alluded to in interviews. After social media messages were removed, followers started to question whether the Winans family was disintegrating. The most absurd aspect was that Marvin was actually involved in several of these arguments. During gatherings where the family used to sing together, people became aware of who had left the stage. Some of the siblings said nothing. When questioned about Marvin, others provided vague responses. Everyone sensed it, but there was no proof. There was a problem. And when things began to settle down, Marvin encountered yet another issue. He started causing more controversy with some of the persons he was spotted with. He met a lot of people as a well-known preacher, including politicians, celebrities, and business people, but not all of them had impeccable reputations. Later, one or two were embroiled in legal disputes or controversies. Although Marvin had nothing to do with their transgressions, his name was brought up. The question then arose, why was a pastor with such a strong reputation in such a setting? I can assure you that guilt by association does exist in the public sphere. Whether Marvin had done anything wrong or not was irrelevant to the public. They simply didn't enjoy his company. People in the church started asking questions. Rumors circulated. Some demanded an explanation from him. Marvin, however, said very little. He continued to act, preach, and make an effort to be above the crowd. But the harm was already done. His already complex story had been further tainted by controversy. Life continued to test Marvin Winans, despite his best efforts to keep going. There was a lot of pressure to keep a clean image, lead a church, and be relevant in the gospel music industry. However, the majority of people were unaware of the skirmishes that took place behind closed doors, and that were impossible for cameras to record. His health began to deteriorate, and his name once more made headlines, this time for concerns rather than music or ministry. Marvin disclosed that he had been battling diabetes, and it wasn't just the type you could ignore. There were issues. His vitality wasn't the same on days when he couldn't sing, and on weeks when he couldn't endure lengthy sermons. And this was devastating for a man who dedicated his life to motivating others. Even the strongest are humbled in this way by life. His supporters took note. Some said, "Is Pastor okay?" in a whisper. Others were afraid he might resign. However, Marvin continued to appear, even when his body pleaded with him to take a break. This is the startling part, though. Not everyone who expressed worry did so. They started to have questions. Some even argued that his health issues were a warning, retribution, or even the consequences of past transgressions. Whispers have the power to become judgment in the church world more quickly than a prayer. Marvin never reacted angrily or lashed out, but he carried with him every day the anguish of being scrutinized while going through a silent ordeal. As if things couldn't become any more difficult, a rumor started circulating among the churchgoers. Marvin intended to retire from it. People were deeply affected by the idea of Marvin stepping down from the pulpit. Would the guy who influenced contemporary gospel music actually leave? His perfecting church had become one of the biggest in Detroit, and people began to worry about its survival. Some even departed, believing that the end was in sight. This was a silent moment, let me tell you. It's the sort that precedes transformation, not the kind you hear at church. Marvin didn't speak much, but his deeds were more powerful than words. He retreated from making public appearances. His previously powerful and beautiful voice now sounded worn out. Worship was not being led by him as it once was, and his inner group began planning behind the scenes. This is where things got interesting. Just in case he couldn't go on, Marvin made an unexpected step while dealing with the health crisis. He put out new music, deeply personal songs that sounded like confessions, and healing, not ostentatious or commercial. Fans were taken aback. Many believed he was finished, but he returned with music that seemed genuine and unadulterated. Awards were no longer the focus. It has to do with surviving, being saved, and possibly even being pardoned. What is unique about this story? When the spotlight goes down, most individuals disappear. Marvin, however, reflected in the darkness. He made no attempt to run away from his past. He did not act as though the controversies had never occurred. Through them he sang. He used them to preach. And he managed to convince folks nonetheless. The strangest thing is that more people than ever before were moved by his music during this silent and agonizing period. Some admirers claimed to have a stronger bond. Some claimed that the music consoled them during their own suffering. And gradually, people began to view Marvin as a wounded warrior who had survived the fire and emerged imperfect but genuine, rather than as a fallen hero. As Marvin Winans entered his older years, he gave up pursuing celebrity. He was followed by fame. However, it was no longer about accolades or hit tunes. It has to do with legacy. Furthermore, Marvin had left a legacy that would endure despite all of the ups and downs. He was no longer only a pastor or a gospel singer. He was now a representation of perseverance. This is the startling part, though. His success did not teach him the most important lessons. They were a result of his suffering. Once standing on enormous platforms next to icons like Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston, the guy was now found in more subdued settings, such as hospital bedsides, little churches, and rooms filled with damaged people in need of hope. After witnessing the glitz, he turned his attention to reality. His sermons became more profound. He spoke more slowly but with greater weight. I can assure you that people pay attention to what Marvin has to say. Because of his scars, not because of his name. Life came full circle in this way. As a young lad with hope and goals, he began singing with his brothers in Detroit. He had endured public humiliation, lost a marriage, seen his body deteriorate, and had sobbed uncontrollably while attending his brother Ronald's funeral. The suffering molded him. He was sightened. Nevertheless, he continued to appear. However, things start to become interesting at this point. Marvin's name began coming up in places no one expected. His songs began to be sampled by young musicians. His lyrics were quoted by secular singers. In addition to believers, his church became a healing haven for the broken, the forgotten, and those who felt abandoned by God. Marvin greeted each of them. You won't believe the number of people who suddenly have a new opinion of him. As a real man, not as a perfect one. Gospel music was no longer the only aspect of his narrative. It was sagging. It had to do with descending and ascending. It was about standing your ground in the face of criticism, rumors, and failure. In response to inquiries about how he survived, Marvin offered the most straightforward response: God's grace. Worst of all, he never made an effort to improve his image. He never gave lengthy interviews outlining himself, never struck back at his detractors, and never published a tell-all. He let his ministry and music do the talking. Perhaps that's why it was successful. Perhaps this explains why, despite all the drama, scandals, and suffering, people still stood up when he walked in. Because he reminded them of someone they knew. A survivor, not a saint or a celebrity. What, then, is unique about this story? It's not simply about a successful man. It tells the story of a man who nearly lost everything yet persevered. Not all of Marvin Winans' songs were about faith. Despite the pain, he lived it, and people never forget that narrative.